Before we dive in, drop a quick hi in the comments. It may seem small, but trust me, it really helps YouTube share this story with more sci-fi fans like us. I'd love to see who's watching.
The first thing General Davidson learned about the High Chamber was that 400 civilizations could watch another civilization be diminished without making a sound. No one moved. Tier upon tier of black stone rose into light that seemed to come from nowhere. Every seat was occupied. Every occupant was perfectly still. General Davidson had been in the room long enough to understand that the stillness wasn't respect. It was rank. The species who moved were the species who had something to prove, and shall not deploy military assets beyond the boundary of their home system without the written consent of this chamber. High Counselor Draum of the Orungar continued reading the terms by which humanity would enter the council. Second, all weapons systems, propulsion systems, and manufacturing capacity designated as advanced by Council survey shall be vetted, catalogued, and limited by Council inspectors. Inspectors shall have unrestricted access to human yards, human orbitals, and human surface installations at any hour, without notice. Counselor Draum was not tall. That was the first thing that surprised humans, and the last thing that mattered. He stood a head shorter than Davidson, and gave the impression of a thing that had been compressed. Broad through the chest, short in the leg, shoulders like a loading gantry. Beneath the ceremonial robe, where the sleeve fell back, small silver scales caught the light and moved it in soft waves. A human mind looked at him and thought fish. Another looked and thought ape. Both were wrong. The hands were the tell. Long palms, thick fingers. Davidson had shaken that hand at the door. It had been like closing a fist around a mooring cleat. Third, human fleet elements shall operate exclusively as support formations under senior species command. Nascent members shall render to this chamber a continuing tribute of raw materials, refined materials, and scientific discovery, for the benefit of the more established members who bear the cost of galactic order. Behind Davidson, Ostrowski shifted his weight. It was a small sound. In that room, it was a shout. Davidson lifted 2 fingers off his knee. Ostrowski stopped. Davidson did not turn around. He kept his eyes on Draum and let his hand settle again, and the moment passed, and up in the gallery, a delegation of tall gray things registered nothing at all, because to them nothing had happened, and that was the point. Counselor Draum turned the page of the record. His fingers were too large for the work, and did it perfectly. He closed the record. Then, and only then, he looked up. Golden eyes, small, set deep under a brow ridge like a bulkhead. In the light, they were flat as coins. Davidson had studied every recording humanity possessed of this creature, and come to the conclusion that Draum's face was not a face at all. It was a wall with a man behind it. The chamber understands, Draum said, that these terms will be difficult for you. The chamber said nothing. You come to us from a hard school. You have fought among yourselves. You have survived a great deal, alone, in the dark, without instruction. This has made you capable, and it has made you proud. And pride in the young is not a vice. It is a symptom. His voice was unhurried. It did not carry the way a human speaker's carried. It simply arrived. But you are young. Your species has wielded fire for less time than this chamber has been in session. You have not yet learned what every people in this room has learned, that the order of things is not an insult. It is the shape of civilization. To be told your place is not to be diminished. It is to be told where you belong. Draum inclined his head a fraction. These terms are generous, Ambassador. I want you to hear that from me directly, and not from your analysts. They are generous. I wrote 3 of them myself, and I wrote them lower than the chamber wished." He meant it. That was the thing Davidson had come to learn, and he had learned it in the first hour. Drom was not gloating. There was no cruelty in him at all. He had looked at humanity, measured it honestly with the only instrument his civilization had ever built, found a child standing in traffic, and walked out into the road to bring it in. "The Council recognizes the ambassador of humanity. You may respond." General Davidson stood. 400 delegations watched a primate straighten to his full height in a room built for every shape of intelligence. And none of that mattered either. He had brought a speech with him. It remained unspoken. "We accept your terms," he said, and sat down. Drom did not move. His face did not move. But in the deep sockets beneath that heavy brow, the gold in his eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. Davidson saw it because he had studied every recording humanity possessed of the Orangar. Their faces gave away almost nothing. Emotion lived in the eyes alone, in the faintest shift of the gold, a fleeting catch of light. They trained themselves from birth to master. Most species never learned to look for it. The High Counselor turned the record over in his enormous hands and set it down, and told himself the young man had simply not understood what had been read to him. They almost never did. "Then it is settled," Drom said. "Welcome to the Council." Humanity had watched the induction live. By the time Davidson's shuttle landed on Tyre, the inspectors were waiting. They came without notice, which was their right, and found every door already open. They walked Tyre and Kesselring Station and the deep orbit foundries, cataloging everything they saw. Where a system exceeded the limits imposed by the Council, it was dismantled or modified without objection, and the paperwork waiting for them was already signed. The heavy warships entered the yards one by one and emerged as something else. Their primary batteries were removed, their missile magazines stripped, and salvage equipment fitted into the space the weapons had occupied. The manifests identified them as fleet tenders and support vessels, and every transfer carried the Council's seal. The Resilient remained in dry dock for 11 days. Captain Doug Copperfield signed the conversion without comment, and the inspector recorded his cooperation as satisfactory. At New Albion, the survey team spent 2 days examining what appeared to be an ordinary mining depot. Ore arrived, containers departed, and freight handlers worked beneath the constant smell of hot iron. They walked rail line 3 from the loading house to the muzzle, kilometers of fixed rail climbing the ridge, with a container waiting in its cradle for the next scheduled launch. They logged it as cargo handling equipment, completed their inspection, and departed. The tribute ships carried refined ore Tyre needed, and rare metals humanity had bled to pull from the ground. The assessments were paid in full, on schedule, without complaint. For 6 months, nothing happened. Then the Ravnos hegemony declared war. Humanity learned of it the way it learned everything now, by official Council dispatch. Each proceeding of the Chamber was transmitted to its member species as a matter of record. Battles, resolutions, casualty reports, requests for reinforcements, they all arrived sealed, indexed, and precisely formatted. The greatest war in recorded history reached Tyre as another packet to be filed. Davidson read every one. The reports described worlds falling, fleets destroyed, and species that had stood for thousands of years disappearing in weeks. Humanity was not asked for ships. It had no vote in military affairs, and no place in the Council's command structure. It was expected to watch. Davidson had no intention of watching. He called Dr. Sabrina Jansen. "I want the Council's dispatches analyzed," he said. "Engagements, loss reports, every fragment they send us." "They haven't asked for our help," Jansen said. "No," Davidson replied. "They've only forbidden us from fighting." There was no prohibition against studying. Within days, teams of engineers, physicists, linguists, and military analysts were pulling every dispatch apart. They measured weapon performance from damaged hulls, reconstructed tactics from battle recordings, and compared reports from 100 species that had never realized they were all describing the same enemy. None of it left Tyre. Humanity had no standing to address the chamber on military matters, and no one thought to ask what the youngest member of the council might have learned. So the dispatches kept arriving, and humanity kept studying. The measure arrived 11 days later. It was not a summons. Junior member species were not summoned. They were informed. Junior member species will remain within their home systems for the duration of the conflict and will take no part in military operations unless directed by the chamber. There was a personal message appended. Davidson opened it. Drom sat in the same chair, in the same light, his enormous hands resting on the stone table. His golden eyes revealed nothing. "You will want to know why," Counselor Drom said. "Not today. Later, when your people ask you, and they will ask you. So I will tell you now, and you will have the answer when you need it." He paused, not for effect. Orungar did not waste words. "This war will consume the great powers. It will devour the Severin. It may devour the Orungar. That is the price of standing at the top of the world. The things that hunt come for you first, because you are worth hunting. Your people are not worth the hunt. That is not an insult, Ambassador. Today, it is the greatest mercy this chamber can offer. Stay within your own system. Grow. When this war is over, there will still be humans, and that is more than I can promise for the Severin." A younger species might have said it with contempt. Drom spoke with the quiet concern of a grandfather warning a child away from thin ice. He had recorded the message himself and sent it to a species with no vote because he believed he had done humanity a kindness. The recording ended. Davidson sat in silence. The Ravnos were working their way down the hierarchy. They hunted the powers that mattered first. Drom believed humanity would survive because it was beneath notice. Davidson reached a different conclusion. Last was not safety. Last was time. He called Johnson. "Double the analysts." They arrived at New Albion on a freight approach. Captain Doug Copperfield stood on the Resilience dock gantry and watched 3 slate-colored hulls descend the lane at survey speed with their bellies open. No screening element, no attack profile, nothing a warship does when it expects to be shot at. They were lining up on the loading house, the way a bulk hauler lines up on a loading house. The Resilient sat dockside beside them with her guns gone, primaries pulled, magazines cut out, the holes filled with salvage rigs and cutting gear, and a clamp array rated to hold a dead freighter still while you took it apart. Fleet tender. Support formation. Council seal on the manifest. The channel opened colony-wide, unencrypted, in flat trade standard. Depot personnel. Stage refined material at Grid 4 and Grid 9. Hold your rail schedule. Do not obstruct the loading corridor. Compliance will be assessed at the conclusion of the harvest. The first pod came down over the North Ridge. It made no sound at all for a long moment. And then all the sound arrived at once, a tearing shriek that ended in a hard, flat crack. The ridge threw up a wall of red dust that rolled down across the processing yard and swallowed the ore lines. More streaks came behind it, a dozen of them. Dirty smoke ruled across a green sky. The dust reached the dock, and the light turned the color of an old penny. Somebody down on the freight apron started shooting. A hand weapon, small and stupid and useless. Then a lot of people started shooting. On the channel, the flat voice stopped in the middle of a sentence. When it came back, the flatness had a crack in it. "The cattle are shooting." Copperfield turned to his deck officer. "Get off my ship," he said. Take the torches. This ship can't stop them. New Albion had security, and they were not a joke. Customs enforcement, a militia, 40-odd people who had done real service somewhere else and come out here for the quiet. Their chief had drilled them and given them a plan, and the plan was good. They held the freight apron for 2 hours against a landing force that had taken apart species older than the human alphabet. They were the best armed thing on the rock, and they made the Ravnos pay for every meter of it. So the Ravnos stopped paying and did what they always did. They went looking for the head. It did not take them long to find it. The governor's office and the security post went in the same strike, and both were clean, and both were textbook. They came down on the admin block without touching the yards, went straight through the roof, and knew exactly which doors to use. They did not clear rooms or hold ground or take anything because they had not come for the building. The governor was dead before anyone knew the strike had come down on him. Then word spread across the open net. A woman in Corridor 3 stopped with a cartridge of hull sealant in her hands. Someone had to say her name twice before she moved again. Then she went back to the bulkhead. The sealant was still needed. Nothing else changed. That was what the Ravnos could not process. The governor died, and the shooting did not pause. Not for a second. Nothing on that rock had ever been coming from that building. But security stopped. The chief went down inside the post with his chest opened, alive and out of it, and his net went down with him. On the apron, his fire team sat in their good positions with their good weapons and waited for the word. The word did not come. They held. They were disciplined. That was the problem. They had a chain. The chain had been cut, and every one of them had been trained by a competent man to wait for orders. So they waited, and the Ravnos came up the apron through them at a walk and killed them in their good positions, one after another, while they waited. 10,000 years of doctrine, working exactly as designed, on the only part of New Albion it fit. The landing officer reported the security node destroyed. Copperfield's people pulled the transmission off a dockside array nobody had bothered to jam. Some minutes later, the same officer asked for the location of the colony's command node. He was told there was not one. He asked again. Then the freight side hit them, and he did not get to ask a third time. The Ravnos cut the orbital relay at dusk. Textbook. Blind the surface, cut the ground off from orbit, isolate and reduce. It had worked on everything that had ever been worth eating. The resilience feeds died with it. Copperfield lost the yards, lost the apron, lost his own people out in the dust, and stood in a dark bay with a ship that could not shoot, and no way to reach anybody. The fighting got worse. He heard it in fragments that night, and put it together for weeks afterward, and never got all of it. Somewhere in Freight Corridor 3, Lisa Verhoeven was trying to keep the ore moving. She had supervised the corridor at New Albion for 11 years. She was not military. She had never carried a rank, never commanded anyone beyond the crews assigned to her shift. Her job was to keep ore moving, containers launching, and schedules from slipping. She knew every meter of the corridor because she was the one who fixed the things that broke. She knew the loading channel beneath number 2 gantry had only one exit because she had filed 2 maintenance requests asking for another. Both had been declined. She knew the gantry carried 40-ton containers and that its emergency drop was mechanical because the depot had been built to move freight, not fight wars. When the Ravnos entered the loading channel, she ran. She ran badly enough that they followed. Then she pulled the emergency drop. Nobody ordered her to do it. There was nobody left to give the order, and she never noticed the absence because the freight crews had never worked that way. They had schedules, procedures, and problems to solve. The person nearest the problem solved it. Ore lasers cut Ravnos armor. Not well and not fast. They were rated for rock. They took their time, and they had to be fed from heavy cables. But armor is material, and a freight depot is a place that cuts material for a living. Torches worked at contact range, if you could reach contact range. Hull sealant worked on faceplates. They lost ground all night. A crew from the processing yard tried to retake the apron with a loader and a plan. They almost made it before the plan met a Ravnos Lance team. The loader burned. The survivors ran. Some did not stop until they were 3 levels down, shaking too hard to hold a torch. The corridor at number 4 bulkhead held because a repair crew welded the blast door shut while people shot at them. There was nothing glorious about it. A welder with a cracked helmet laid the final bead while hydraulic fluid poured over his back from a burst line like warm rain. His hands shook so badly he braced one wrist against the deck. Beside him, a man screamed on a note nobody in that crew ever forgot. He finished the weld. The door held. They bled. They failed. But they did not stop. The Ravnos could not understand why. There was no command post driving the resistance, no officer rallying the defense, no chain to sever. Every time they destroyed one group, another picked up the work because the work was still there. The landing officer filed his report at midnight. Severing colony communications had increased resistance. He had no word for that. Neither did his doctrine. He read the report back 3 times to make sure he had written it correctly before transmitting it. The reply came back almost immediately. Continue the harvest on schedule. The cruiser descended into low orbit at first light and took station. It was there to receive cargo. That was the only reason a Ravnos battle group had stopped at a rock beneath its notice. You do not lift ore out of a gravity well in landing craft. You put it on the rail. Rail Line 3 climbed 4 kilometers up the north ridge from the loading house to a launch cradle that pointed at the sky. Every 90 minutes it threw a 40-ton container into orbit. It had never missed its schedule. A council inspector had walked the line end-to-end with a survey pad, logged it as cargo handling equipment, and departed. The Ravnos had reached exactly the same conclusion. Do not damage the rail. The rail is how the material leaves. 2 Ravnos stood guard at the loading house to make sure nobody damaged it. Verhoeven reached the ridge with 30 people, most of them rail crew. Months earlier, Tyre had circulated another routine advisory. One of hundreds. Jansen's analysts produced reports every week. Most changed nothing. Verhoeven had read this one because freight supervisors read paperwork. Ravnos shielding is tuned against coherent energy. Nothing else. No recommendation. No tactical doctrine. No instruction. They cranked the rail flat. It had never been designed to depress. They did it anyway with cutting gear, a loader, and a man hanging from the elevation jack with his full weight. It took 20 minutes. It destroyed the cradle bearings. It did not matter. The rail would only ever do this once. They loaded a container of unrefined ore. Above them, the cruiser waited for its cargo. Shields raised against every weapon 10,000 years of war had ever taught the Ravnos to fear. A rock does not care. The chute fired. Copperfield felt it through the dock plates 30 kilometers away, a deep crack that climbed through the ship. By the time he reached a viewport, a white line burned across the sky, and the cruiser was coming apart at the waist. Not an explosion. A tearing. 40 tons traveling 8 kilometers a second entered one side of the ship and exited the other, carrying the middle of the cruiser with it. The 2 halves drifted apart with their lights still burning. There had never been a counter. In 10,000 years, nobody had thrown a warehouse at them. They loaded another container. The second cruiser found the rail almost immediately. A mass driver is 4 kilometers of steel bolted to a ridge. The moment it fires, everyone knows where it is. The cruiser walked its fire down the line from the muzzle. The crews kept loading. The rail died backwards, section by section, until the fire reached the cradle, and the north ridge disappeared into white light. Verhoeven's leg was somewhere inside it. They pulled her out 3 hours later, and she was still giving instructions. The chute was gone. So were the loading house, the ore lines, the processing yard, and the sorting sheds. Everything that had made New Albion worth invading had burned away in a single night. Nobody would rebuild it. Not in anyone's working life. They still had the rock. The battle on the ground was over. The depot burned. One Ravnos cruiser was dead. One was fleeing. One still tumbled in orbit, crippled but alive. Copperfield stood for a long moment, looking at the wreck hanging above New Albion. 6 months ago he would have needed a warship. Now he had something else. The Resilient had no guns, but she had clamps, grapples, and cutting rigs. 200 people whose entire job for the past 6 months had been learning how to take dead ships apart. He looked at his deck officer. Cast off. The Resilient lifted clear of the dock and climbed toward the crippled Ravnos cruiser. He took her the way he took any wreck: match the tumble, clamp the flank, cut where the armor was thinnest. He knew where that was because Jansen's people had written a paper on Ravnos hull metallurgy. Then it went bad. Ravnos at contact range were stronger than anything he had ever put hands on. Not faster. Stronger and heavier, and they did not go down when they should have. Human rifles did not do enough. The first compartment cost him 9 people in under a minute, and his boarding party went backwards through their own breach, with a lance team coming after them. Copperfield lost his weapon somewhere in that, got a hand on a bulkhead frame, and did not remember the next part clearly at all. His deck officer dragged him out by the collar. They did it again with the clamps. They put the arms through the hull and peeled compartments open from outside and let vacuum do the work. Where that failed, they went in with ore lasers off a cable feed and cut them down at 3 meters, with a beam meant for granite. When a Ravnos boarding craft came across to retake the hull, they caught it with a grapple, turned it around, and put it back into its own hangar bay at 40 meters a second. Nobody looked good doing it. Nobody was fast or clean or brave in a way that would have filmed well. They fought like a salvage crew. It took 4 hours. He cut into the command deck at the end of it, through a floor, with a torch, in the dark. The Ravnos in there were still working, still upright, still at stations, still running a battle that no longer existed. He killed them because that was the job. They were bigger than him, and it was ugly, and it was close, and the last one went hard. Then the ship died. Guns, drives, compartments, everything that had still been trying fell silent the moment the command deck stopped talking. Copperfield stood in the dark, with his hands shaking, and looked at the dead bridge. 12 hours earlier, the Ravnos had landed on New Albion and gone straight for the governor and the security post. They had expected the colony to stop when its leaders died. It hadn't. He had just done the same thing to them. The cruiser had died the moment its command deck fell silent. For the first time since the pods had landed, he understood what they had been trying to do. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he keyed his rig. Deck's clear. Bring the clamps. That was all he ever said about it. The Ravnos. Hegemony left New Albion at midday. They had never done that before. There was no procedure for it. What was left of the battle group made orbit, gathered the landing elements it could reach, abandoned the ones it could not, and went out of the system on a bearing that was not a withdrawal, because the Ravnos language did not have a word for that either. Behind them, the depot burned. The colony held the ground. Overlord Zethrav read the report in a red room. He was long-jawed and motionless, and he had commanded the hegemony's advance since it came out of the core. He had taken Forge worlds and killed fleets that had sailed since before humanity used fire, and he had never once needed to read a report twice. He read this one twice. He was not angry. Anger is a thing you feel when something has gone wrong in a way you understand. A depot, a warehouse, something beneath the hunt. He gave the order for Asterion. Asterion was the council's capital. It had a chamber, a high counselor, and every fleet in the ordered galaxy waited on his word. If New Albion could not explain humanity, perhaps the people who ruled them could. At Tyre. 4 days later, Davidson read the report standing up. Then he set it on the table and looked at the wall for a while. "Sir?" Jansen said. "They noticed us," Davidson said. The inspector came to New Albion once the lane was certified clear. He walked the rock for 2 days with a pad and a council seal, because Restriction 2 gave him access at any hour, without notice, and nobody obstructed inspectors. The processing yard was black glass. The sorting sheds were gone. Rail Line 3 was 4 kilometers of slag, with a launch cradle at the bottom of it, and the elevation jack had been driven down past its own stops and sheared off. He photographed the jack for a long time. In orbit, he photographed the other thing, because it was still there and nobody had moved it. A Ravnos heavy cruiser in 2 pieces, lights still burning in the forward section, with a hole through her that went in at the flank and out through the spine. He ran it against the council weapons register twice. Nothing on the register made that hole. He did not ask anyone what had happened. There was no field on the form for it, and he had come to inspect a depot. He filed on the 10th day. Complete, in format, without redaction. Summary line: depot decommissioned. Cargo handling equipment expended. No advanced systems present. Nobody read it. It had been filed by a member with no vote in military affairs. Then Zeth Rav broke off the Severin front. Everyone in the chamber could see he had them. He was weeks from finishing the Severin entirely. And instead, the whole hegemony turned 90 degrees and set course for Asterion. The chamber did not understand why. So a clerk searched the archive for a reason and found the only hegemony contact in 60 days with no engagement record attached to it. It came up on Draum's desk at the bottom of a list of dozen documents, described as Routine Installation Survey, Human Depot, New Albion. He read the summary line, then the body, then the photographs, then the body again. Cargo handling equipment expended. Draum sat alone in his office with the door closed and looked at a photograph of an elevation jack that had been driven 4 degrees past its own stops by something with a body on it. He thought about a survey team that had walked that rail end to end and logged it and departed. He thought about the man who had written the restriction that put them there. He had written 3 of them himself. He had written them lower than the chamber wished. In the empty room, beneath the heavy brow, the gold in his eyes brightened like a coal. Hours later, Draum's shuttle came into Tyre with 1-8 aboard and no escort, and there was no protocol for any part of it. There was no protocol for a high counselor leaving Asterion in wartime. There was none for him going to a member state uninvited, because members came to the chamber. The chamber did not come to members. There was certainly none for a freight office, which was where he ended up, because it was the room with a table big enough, and nobody had thought to prepare anything else. He walked in past a wall chart of lift schedules and stood on a floor with tie-down rings set into it. Davidson met him there. Jansen stood by the table. "Asterion will fall," he said. "The Severin are broken. The fleets that could have held Asterion no longer exist, and the fleets that exist cannot reach it. The hegemony arrives in 19 days. His voice was exactly as it had been in the chamber, unhurried. It simply arrived. "I have come to ask for your assistance." "We can't," Davidson said. The gold did not move. No deployment beyond our home system without the written consent of the chamber, Davidson said. Human fleet elements operate exclusively as support formations under senior species command. We have no consent, and there is no senior command left standing to attach us to. He paused. I can't cross the line, sir. You wrote it. I signed it. It's law. There it was. Counselor Drum stood in a freight office in a human system and looked up at a human and did not move a muscle and did not apologize. An Orangar does not apologize. Apology is a performance, and performance is for those who need to be believed. Humanity's rank, he said, was misassessed. That was all. It was the greatest admission Davidson had ever heard an Orangar make. The correction is entered as of this hour and will be laid before the chamber for ratification, which the chamber will grant, because the chamber has no one else. The restrictions on deployment are void. You will not serve under senior command. There is no senior command. Something in the flat voice moved very slightly. You will deploy as you see fit. With what? Davidson said. Drum looked at the human and had no answer. Your inspectors took my warship 6 months ago, Davidson continued. Primaries pulled, magazines cut out, salvage rigs welded into the holes, every transfer signed, every manifest sealed. I have 11 heavy hulls and not one gun on any of them, and you cannot put a fleet back together in 14 days. The High Counselor stood absolutely still on the tie-down rings in a human freight office. He had written that one rule himself, too. Then what will you send? He said. What we have. Davidson turned his head. Doctor. Give him everything. Dr. Jansen had it ready. She had had it ready for weeks. She put the file on the table, and it was not a token or a bargaining position. It was 6 months of work by people who had nothing else to do because they had been forbidden to do anything else. Hull metallurgy, lance recovery intervals, drive tolerances, shield tuning, the shape of hegemony doctrine, assembled fragment by fragment from 100 species dispatches by analysts who had never seen a Ravnos and had come to know one. Drum put his enormous hand on it and did not open it. How long have you had this? Since the war started, Johnson said. Why was it not filed? There's no form. She said it without insolence, because it was simply true. Sir, I looked. There's a field for what we found. There's no field for what we think it means. There's nowhere to send it. Drum was silent. Then he asked, Who commanded the defense of the depot? Nobody, Davidson said. Who gave the orders? There weren't any orders. Drum's head turned a fraction. Ambassador. A landing force of the Ravnos hegemony was defeated on that rock. Someone had to be directing it. The relay was cut about an hour in, Davidson said. The governor was dead before that. The security chief went down at the post in the first strike. After that, there was nobody to give anybody anything. He did not say it as a lesson. He was answering a question he had been asked. Drum stood in the freight office with his hands at his sides and did not move. 19 days, Drum said at last. That was the time the Ravnos would take to arrive at Asterion. We'll be there in 14, Davidson said. 19 days later, Zeth Rav reached Asterion and went for the vault within the first 6 hours of his arrival. It lay under a mountain, behind 9 species worth of ingenuity, and it held longer than anything he had ever cut into. Then it opened, and the word stopped coming. Across 100,000 kilometers of orbit, the Council's ships stopped shooting and held station. Correct. Formidable. Waiting. Guns loaded. Crews at post. Nobody firing. Because for 11,000 years, there had always been someone above them to say when. It was the pattern that had won them every war before. It had never failed. 11 human hulls came in from the flank while it was still happening. They had no guns. Every one of them had been gutted in a council yard and certified by a council inspector. And what they had instead was clamps, grapples, cutting rigs, or lasers on cable feeds, and 2,000 people who had spent 6 months learning how to get inside ships that did not want them. Copperfield picked a Ravnos battlecruiser off the line and went straight at her. She shot at him. Tenders are not built to be shot at. He took a lance through the forward section on the way in and kept coming because the geometry was the geometry. And then the Resilient came down on that cruiser's flank, and the clamps went home, and the 2 ships were one object. She could not shoot him then. Nothing could shoot him then. Everything the hegemony had was tuned for range, and he was bolted to their hull. They cut in 3 meters aft of the forward lance housing, where the plate seam ran soft, because Jansen's people had written a paper on Ravnos metallurgy, and nobody in the ordered galaxy had read it, except the men now standing on it with a torch. Then 200 people went in with cable-fed lasers and cutting gear, and no illusions. It wasn't clean. It was salvage work inside a warship, done one compartment at a time. They cut their way forward, and the ones who went in did not all come out. Copperfield reached the command deck through the floor, in the dark, with a torch. He killed the crew inside. The cruiser died. The Ravnos had a doctrine for fleets, and a doctrine for fortresses, and a doctrine for worlds. They had nothing for 11 unarmed tenders walking along their own hulls, opening command decks with industrial equipment. 2 of the 11 did not come back. The rest kept working. And on the freight channel, the slow, dumb, wide-open pipe the Council had given its support formation 6 months ago, because human vessels shall not be assigned independent objectives. The human crews were reading out targets while they cut. Bearing. Range. The seam 3 meters aft of the lance housing. The humans were not giving orders. They had no authority to do that. They were doing what salvage crews had always done, calling out what they saw. A Severin battlecruiser had been sitting silent for 40 minutes with a full magazine, waiting for a voice that would never come. There was no voice. There was a tow truck calling out a plate seam. The Severin fired. Then another did. Then a formation that had been holding station since the vault fell moved without permission for the first time in 11,000 years. It chose. Zethrav watched it from a red room. He had come to Asterion because a warehouse could not explain itself, and the thing that ruled the warehouse would be here, in the chamber, where every order in the ordered galaxy came from. He had found it. He had removed it. He had done it correctly and on schedule. He had killed the only head in the room. It had not been theirs. The hegemony withdrew into the core and never emerged again. The chamber ratified it 11 days later. Davidson entered the chamber, where he had stood only once before, on the day humanity was accepted into the Galactic Council. Tiered galleries, light from somewhere above with no visible source. Fewer delegations than there had been, considerably fewer, and the empty tiers were not draped or marked in any way, because the chamber did not decorate its losses. They did not like him. He knew that walking in. Several delegations had voted against ratification and had said why at length in the record, and their reasons were not stupid. 9,000 years of order had held this galaxy together, and it had been broken open by a freight supervisor with no rank at all, and a great many species in that room understood exactly what that meant for them. Draum stood at the record. "The chamber has amended the standing of the human species," he said. "The restrictions of induction are struck in their entirety. The species is entered at full standing, with vote in all matters, without term." He turned a page with fingers too large for the work. "A seat has been placed." It had. down on the floor in the ring, among the old ones. Ambassador. Davidson walked. It was not far. 400 delegations watched Davidson cross that floor, and there was no sound in the chamber at all. He did not speak. There was nothing that needed saying. He sat down. Draum looked at him. In this room, a young species had once been handed its place and had accepted it in 4 words. The gold had moved in Draum's eyes then, and he had told himself the boy had not understood what was read to him. But the human had understood every word. He had taken the terms and obeyed them to the letter, and let them make him into exactly what the chamber said he was, and the chamber's own hand had built the thing that saved it. The rail, the tenders, the archive. Every one of them signed and sealed and inspected. The gold in his eyes brightened. Draum did not look away. He held the human's eyes and let the whole galaxy witness the one thing his people had always been able to conceal. It was the only way he knew how to apologize.
Hey there, space human. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this video. Drop a quick comment and let me know what's on your mind. Or just say hi if you prefer. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Also, remember to check the pinned comment. Trust me, it's worth a look. Oh, and one last thing. I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here. Or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.